very pleased to introduce to you David Dixon. While I know David very well, I'm going to read from his bio so I don't mess up and leave anything out. David is the principal in charge of planning and urban design at Goody Clancy. David has led a wide range of significant projects in North America for public, private, and institutional clients. His commitment to enhancing quality of life and economic opportunity for urban communities is consistent throughout his work. David speaks frequently throughout the country on a range of urban issues, including smart growth, downtown revitalization, integrating growth into historic urban environments, sustainable mixed-income neighborhoods, and density as an essential tool for revitalizing urban communities. David has led many of Goody Clancy's award-winning projects, gaining recognition from groups such as the Congress for New Urbanism, the Society for College and University Planning, the American Planning Association, and the American Institute of Architects. In 2013, the American Planning Association honored Goody Clancy planning and urban design practice with their National Excellence Award for a planning firm. The American Institute of Architects awarded David in 2007 his Thomas Jefferson Award for a lifetime of significant achievement in creating livable neighborhoods, vibrant civic spaces, and vital downtowns. In 2012, Residential Architect inducted David into their Hall of Fame for his lifetime of work creating equitable and opportunity-rich residential communities. As a 2003 president of the Boston Society of Architects, David chaired the first national conference on density. David has written extensively on post-industrial opportunity challenges facing America's cities, including as co-author of Urban Design for an Urban Century, which will be published in his second edition early this year. An article for Planning magazine entitled Wish Fulfillment that describes a 50-year vision for America's cities. David is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. As chair of the AIA's Regional and Urban Design Committee, David helped shape the AIA's response to Hurricane Katrina and went on to prepare the post-Katrina master plan for New Orleans. David frequents New Orleans as he continues to work on downtown plans for the city. David holds a BA from Wesleyan University, a Master of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and a Master's of Urban Design from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming David as tonight's lecturer.
Always ask your office to send out a very short bio. But thank you very much. That was very nice. I appreciate it. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I unfortunately am going to give a kind of a boring talk because while my first temptation was just to show you lots of magnificent pictures of amazing things that are happening in cities, to me it is actually more interesting to figure out how they're happening and the kinds of things that each and every one of you can do to make things happen that basically haven't been possible in cities, probably for 60 years. We're in an amazing period. So this is about making cities more livable, equitable, and resilient. It's more about the how than what all these look like, but I'll show you some pictures. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to introduce myself ever so briefly. I'm going to talk about the context, the perspective that I think we should all take on cities today. And then I'm going to talk I'm going to talk about something I'll call strategic urbanism, a term I discovered or invented yesterday, so it's not a classic term. Basically, to talk about the kinds of strategies that can make amazing things, not amazing, really important, really humane, really just things happen in New Orleans and most other cities in America. So when I was a little kid, this was the reason Steve could say all those nice things is because I'm very old. When I was a kid, the Secretary of the Treasury basically said in public, and nobody thought it was strange, what's good for General Motors is good for America. And this, if my parents would have bought a car like this, I would have been in seventh heaven when I was growing up, but they thought they were silly. My favorite place to go in the world was actually the first building designed by, because I grew up in Los Angeles, by Goody Clancy, the Monsanto all plastic, I should say, house of the future at Disneyland. I thought this was just perfect, but I grew up and see life in very different terms today. And I found, actually, I know this is odd, I found on the web I wrote when I was looking for other information, and it really brought back a lot of memories because I first came to New Orleans many years ago for an American Planning Association conference. And I remember being told not to walk outside the Hilton, which I thought was sort of silly. This is a city that has come a long way. But I came back about a month after Katrina at the behest of the American Institute of Architects, which had decided to come and help. And I went back to Boston and wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe, and I'm going to read just a little bit of it. America's City of Jazz has gone silent. When I arrived in New Orleans last week to participate in the Governor's Conference on Recovery and Rebuilding, nothing had prepared me for the sights and stillness of New Orleans 2 months after Hurricane Katrina. A disaster of epic proportions is already slipping from our national consciousness and conscience. More than 100 additional bodies were discovered the day before I wrote this, bringing the death toll to more than 1,000. This was, it was impossible for the rest of us, I don't know how many of you were not in New Orleans then, to imagine what had happened to New Orleans and what the state of a great American city was. And I say this in part to sort of as a testament to how much New Orleans has come back, how many wonderful things have happened. And they've many cases happened because particularly you have an activist mayor now, a lot of people have worked really hard. But New Orleans has come back because New Orleans is as well positioned as just about any city in America to thrive today. And I want to talk about that. But first, my familiarity with New Orleans goes back to Angela O'Byrne, who's sitting right in front of me, who basically suggested that we work together on the Unified New Orleans Plan. And I came down, and the fellow speaking is Marshall Truhill IV, who's one of my real heroes, who really helped introduce me to New Orleans. Then, again, with Angela and others on the master plan, and more recently on the livable Claiborne corridor, which was a real wonderful chance to sort of drill down and work with community folks at a very much at a neighborhood level. But, so what are some of the forces that have helped New Orleans come back? First of all, it's important to note that Louisiana and America need cities like New Orleans to come back because this country's future is in its cities. Fracking aside, it is knowledge economies. It is our knowledge economy that is growing. And basically, it is our knowledge economy that actually produces the exports that allow our standard of living to hopefully increase. 85% of America's economy is in its, I don't know why 259, but this is the statistic I got, largest cities. That read metro areas, incomes are higher. These cities have produced all of the growth that this country has had, certainly in the last 10 years. New Orleans is similarly really important to Louisiana's economy. And I'm going to ask you to sort of remember that when I talk about some of the ways in which cities are coming back a little bit. You have more than 35% of the state's economy. You have a GDP. This is going to sound sort of strange. You have a GDP that when you work at a gross domestic product, an economy that actually for your area isn't that much smaller than Switzerland's. And I say that because think how much Switzerland is able to get done in terms of investing in infrastructure and other things. We tell ourselves that America can't match what countries like Germany and Switzerland do because we're so much bigger. But in fact, in concentrated metros like this, New Orleans at this point, your GDP has grown so fast since Katrina. First of all, your GDP has grown more than Louisiana's economy has grown, meaning all the growth has come out of this metro area. But to me, one of the most important things for any city today is to realize the potential it has and to be confident because this confidence is merited based on its economic potential and standing. As we think about this, it's important to remember that this country is actually in the midst of producing, why I can't tell you, but somehow we are managing an extreme shortage of skilled and educated workers. Basically, 60% of the jobs we're going to create between now and 2030 and will require a college degree, and 40% of the workforce we're going to train will have college degrees. This is placing cities in really active, sometimes it goes beyond active competition to attract skilled and educated workers and to hold on to those that they have. I used to say that if my kids could walk down Frenchman Street at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, they'd move to New Orleans in an instant. Luckily for me, because I want them to stay where they are, they haven't done that. But New Orleans has an environment that is as compelling as an urban environment as any city in America today. And it is the folks who, college-educated, creative folks, the folks who are the basic resource, the basic building block of our economy today, are overwhelmingly interested in living in walkable urban areas. If you ever get bored and want to go read census data, the number of college-educated 25 to 34-year-olds in major cities increased more than 25% in the last census decade. Most of that in the last 5 years, that census. This is a trend that's accelerating. There are a lot of cities where the number went up 40 or 50%. That's all has to do with how these folks, where and how these folks wanted to live. Well, there are other reasons why cities are important. Urban life is a lot healthier. Basically, if you live out in a completely auto-dependent environment, the public health data for 1,000 of you is about twice as worse, you're about twice as worse off than the folks who live in neighborhoods where they don't have to drive as much and do a lot of walking. So basically, if you live in a neighborhood, not even necessarily transit served, but where you can, an urban neighborhood, you probably drive less than half as much as your friends who live out in an exurb, and that does make you far healthier. It also, the cores of cities are the only place where we can really make significant progress in what's a shared national responsibility around sustainability to lower our carbon footprint. But cities also, in many ways, are less expensive places to live. Folks who live out in the exurbs nationally across this country spend about a quarter of their disposable income on transportation today. This country spends more on gas than we do on food now. Started, I think, about 2010. In 2000, we spent probably 4 times as much on food as on gas. This is the cost of transportation, if you don't have access to transit, is spiraling. So for a bunch of reasons, it's not surprising that if you go out and talk to anybody in the housing market, doesn't matter how old or how young or how hip or how whatever they are, in the 1990s, you ask them, well, what criteria would make you choose a place to live? Golf courses were right at the top of that list, and big backyards, and you can read the list, and homogeneity was very important. If you ask folks today, anybody, any age, I need to stress that, the list is entirely different. None of the top 5, in fact, I don't think any of the top 10 criteria that were there in the mid-90s are still on the list. Believe me, golf courses are not a source of wealth if you're a developer today. It's walkable streets, access to transit, and diversity has become a plus in the marketplace. If you're somebody who's lived a life like mine, the idea that diversity would attract the real estate market was unimaginable for most of my working life, but it is the case today. This photograph is from Providence, Rhode Island, where they are rehabbing a building downtown into 100 very tiny little studios, sort of micro units, and these are some of the 1,000 people that have waited in line to sign up for those. For our Claiborne project, we did a market study. Market study. The Claiborne project basically looked at all of the neighborhoods along the Claiborne Expressway, and it was a study that basically looked at the costs and benefits of removing the overhead, the expressway, the viaduct. Well, we did a market study. What sort of housing demand is there? And you can all read the numbers, but you'll notice that 22% of that was single family, and 78% of that was for multifamily housing. This is not cheap multifamily housing. In fact, when you look at the market rate segment, they're at least as interested in multifamily housing as people who are looking, for example, for workforce housing. This is part of a profound shift, and I guess it's the term is the great inversion, which has been up on the slides. But basically, those of us who have been out working for a while have lived in a world where single-family houses were the sort of default assumption in terms of what people wanted and how you built a community and how you appealed to the market. That is completely wrong today. Basically, demand has shifted so dramatically that we now demand for multifamily housing, think not little garden apartments but lofts, is probably probably 3 times or more, roughly 3 times the demand for single-family housing. If you think about it for a second, we're not going to build this much multifamily housing in cities, at least not to keep up with the pace of demand over the next 10 years, which is one reason why urban housing is accelerating so much faster in terms of cost than particularly suburban housing. And if you look at Detroit, there is one neighborhood in Detroit that is actually quite successful these days, where real estate prices are actually rising, and that's Midtown, which is the one basically district in Detroit which is predominantly multifamily and sort of loft. As when people live in multifamily housing at larger density, at higher densities, a lot of kind of amazing things become possible. For example, if you can collect 1,000 to 2,000 housing units within a 5 or 10 minute walk of a block of a street, you can create a main street. You can bring a street to life. When we lived in a world where single-family houses were the default, we couldn't even think about equations like that. But today we can. Now, if we scatter development, if you build 2,000 units over 10 or 15 blocks or on sort of scattered sites, the impact, you don't have the benefit. But if you can concentrate development along main streets, think of some of the eroded areas, major streets as coming into downtown, you can bring streets to life. It is probably not surprising that for the last year, for basically up until the Great Recession, suburban housing values were rising faster than other housing values in this country, pretty much year in and year out from the end of World War II until the Great Recession. Since then, the process has been reversing, and the change has been accelerating. So last year, housing in cities appreciated 10% faster, housing in sort of high-rise neighborhoods 20% faster, and housing in diverse, cool neighborhoods 40% faster than suburban housing. Well, all this one wonders why we can't all go home and lie down and let our cities sort of boom around us and go out and enjoy them. There is a major fly in the ointment, so to speak, because we are also a rapidly aging society. And to go back and look at actually housing prices for a minute, thinking forward, starting in about 2 years, folks over 65 tend to sell houses. And for years, they sold them to folks in their 30s and 40s, and there were more folks in their 30s and 40s than in their 60s, so housing prices went up, particularly for single-family houses. Unfortunately, there are now, and there will be for about 20 years, a lot more folks over turning 65 and growing older than there will be folks in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. So we're going to have extreme pressures on the value of single-family houses, particularly some distance from a city, when there are other challenges also, for instance, lack of transit. But there's another issue here. We all need help as we get older. Our medical costs skyrocket. We stop working, all the things we know about. Well, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid today consume about 55% of all the taxes the government collects. And for the foreseeable future, the taxes we collect probably aren't going to rise significantly for reasons I don't need to dwell on. If we project forward to 2050, it's going to be 100%. Basically, we are living in a period where the federal government's disposable portion of the budget, the portion that is not earmarked or is not mandatory in terms of Social Security or Medicare or the military or other things over which basically the government has literally no discretion. The discretionary portion of the budget is disappearing. This is what has paid for transit, for affordable housing, for new health clinics and hospitals for all the things that the private sector doesn't give us. And what I'm going to spend the balance of this talk really focusing on is how can we basically tap into this incredible urban revival, which has at least 20 years to run when we look at the demographics, and accomplish the things that are so important for our cities without our ability to rely on the federal government. This is the first time, basically since World War II, that we are really facing a sustained period of an inability to turn to the feds for help. As a moment of personal marketing, some friends and I wrote a book called Urban Design for an Urban Century, and the second edition, which is going to be much better than the first edition, is coming out in, I think, March, Wiley, and we'll talk about all these issues. So, I'm going to come back to the term I invented yesterday, strategic urbanism. One of the things that is very fortuitous at this moment is that as opposed to much of even the last 2 decades, when we used one set of policies to create jobs and investment, that's an RMB, that's a Chinese coin, because I first used this slide in China. Another set of policies around the environment and sustainability, and another set of policies to enhance quality of life. In recent years, these have been, there's been much more of a sort of a synergy developing across the board. And today, basically, what one does for quality of life is what one needs to do to attract jobs and investment and to create a more sustainable region. And if you think about some of the things I talked about before, if we live in basically a knowledge economy and we want to attract bright young folks, that's all about great environments. The most important thing we can do for our environment is to reverse sprawl and grow inward, and that's once again about creating livability and the kinds of environment people want to live in at the core. So basically, investing in people has become the way to invest to build our economy and create a more sustainable world, and that we're very lucky to have that confluence. So what would I suggest as I look around? We work in lots of different cities, and they're all wrestling with these issues. So there are a couple of observations that I would put before you that I think are actually quite relevant to New Orleans. First, to take advantage of the pro-urban markets, this era of urban revival, which is still taking some of us a while to get used to. To basically become wealthier cities. Cities cannot afford not to grow wealthier, and that's kind of a tough message, but it's going to be very important. As we can't rely on federal dollars, cities are going to have to build their economies and their wealth so that they can leverage these dollars to basically do the things they need to do as cities. To do this, cities in part have to become more globally competitive, and that's frankly all about knowledge industries and creating a great quality of life. And to do this takes 2 things, basically. It takes public leadership. It's ironic, as public resources are declining, as the federal government is basically running out of discretionary dollars, as mayors face more and more pressures around budgets, the public sector is actually becoming more important, because what we have to now do is depend much more on an era of public-private partnerships and public institutional partnerships, and do a lot of planning to bring communities, to build community support for work that partnerships will do. The city isn't just going out and doing it itself. This makes actually mayors and actually mayors probably more than anyone, but also governors, more important than they have been for a long time in terms of change and progress in cities. So what do I think cities really need to focus on, and where is this leadership really necessary? It's around placemaking that creates social and economic value, equity that enables everyone to contribute and share in the value that's created, and resilience that builds on this foundation of value and equity. And I'm going to start with placemaking. And once again, I'm really going to focus more on how these things are done, less on the sort of design qualities that I think have made them successful. If you want to ask, please ask me a question. So, placemaking is really what connects quality of life and livability and economic opportunity. It is where all the fact that that the renminbi, the earth, and the smiling face all came together is really about creating a great place for people is what is central to doing those other things. So I think there are 4 qualities I want to talk about. First is creating walkable density, not just density. We have to grow denser at a neighborhood level and at an urban level, and I hope that will be clearer. But density for its own sake doesn't accomplish anything unless it is designed and planned to bring streets to life, to create the amenity that makes cities more livable. We need, as we grow more diverse, to expand choices so that people with more diverse lifestyles can all enjoy the sort of quality of life that comes more naturally when we all want the same things. We need to create public spaces that really celebrate diversity and community, particularly as we become more fragmented as a society. And I think an issue that I found fascinating in New Orleans is the debate over sort of preservation versus development, because in fact it is preserving our past that gives meaning to, I think, our present and our future, and should really inspire much of the new development we do. So I'm going to give some examples of creating walkable density. And this is about creating the critical mass of people and activity that will bring streets to life and therefore connect people to each other, to place, create a sense of community. And it's basically essential for the success of downtowns, neighborhoods, innovation districts in terms of attracting the kinds of investment today to fix problems, to create great public spaces, to create schools, parks, anything, as we move into an era of scarcer and scarcer federal dollars. So let's start with Rosslyn, Virginia, which was one of the original edge cities. I don't know, do any of you know Rosslyn, Mountain County? Okay. It's an awful place. This is what I'm sorry, I'll come back to and because it's an awful place, it was designed for the car. It has to grow much denser, basically to rebuild its environment from auto-centric into people-centric. That's something we couldn't have imagined doing for years as we watched Rosslyn grow more and more dreadful, but today we can. So this is what Rosslyn can look like in about 20 years, actually about 15 years. No one in here should for a moment think that this image has anything to do with Rosslyn's success, because what is really important, if it's going to build all those wonderful buildings, who cares? If building those buildings can transform environments like this into environments like this, because Rosslyn has basically done a plan, they're doing a plan, we're doing the planning, to work with folks and build strong community support for increasing density and height in the right places in ways that don't disturb a blade of grass on anybody's lawn if you have a single-family house nearby, are concentrated where density and height belong. They can build support for this and then basically sell the increased height and density to the private sector in return for, they make some more profit, but in return for building a whole new generation of, these are almost the cliche things, parks, lively streets, affordable housing, the arts. A developer is, in order to get a couple more stories, building a supermarket, which is something absolutely everybody asks for in urban neighborhoods. Rosslyn, because if it can create this kind of environment, can be much more competitive in the Washington market as a place to live and work, can basically create the premiums with height and value. So without any public investment or very little, they are able to literally transform themselves into a walkable, mixed-use, lively, I think much more wonderful environment. This same sort of approach holds true in very different situations. This is East Franklinton in Columbus, Ohio. Do any of you know Columbus at all? Okay. I put Columbus in here because, Rosslyn has a really strong real estate economy. Columbus is just like lots of other places in this world. It's a city that's having some successes, some challenges. This is an area that is largely vacant. It's the poorest neighborhood in Columbus. It's not far from downtown, full of old factories, etc. It's coming back to life. This is I was sort of joking to somebody here. This is some planning we finished about a year ago. It began to implement itself as before we finished the planning, basically because what the planning led to was the city taking responsibility to form a partnership with the housing authority that owned some land, a community development corporation that owned a great big old building, excuse me, an arts developer, and go out and buy whatever property these folks didn't own so that they basically controlled all the land in East Franklinton, or enough of it. That meant that they could have confidence that if they began to develop it, they could manage the development in such a way they knew what would come in, when, and where. They could put the pieces together that had sort of the magic to bring a genuine sort of arts, young entrepreneurs neighborhood to life. And the city was willing to invest a lot of its housing dollars into subsidizing artist housing. About 30% of the housing will be subsidized for artists long-term to sort of maintain the sort of coolness and the authenticity of this neighborhood. Now, part of that was because the mayor cared about folks like this. He wanted to have what he called a funky town in Columbus. But part of it was his very deep awareness that this authenticity, this ability to really keep a cool, interesting, diverse community here would make East Franklinton a lot more valuable and a place that contributed in a much more fundamental way to the city's fiscal position and to Columbus economy. This was a way to, as he put it, keep kids when they graduated, for those of you who are younger, sorry for the kids, but keep young adults when they graduated from OSU from leaving, because here's a neighborhood they'd want to live in and until they built careers. Not far from, about 5 miles from East Franklinton, is a city, or a suburb, Dublin, Ohio. It calls itself a city. It's the wealthiest suburb in Ohio. It's the one of the centers for Class A office space, really high-end office space, hugely successful. And its city manager, who's been a friend of mine for a number of years, came in and told, actually when he interviewed for the job, told the city council, we have some problems. Our population's getting a lot older. They're going to start selling their houses. The companies that we have here really depend on educated creative workers, and they're not coming to Central Ohio in the first place. They'd rather come to New Orleans, and they're really not going to come out to Dublin. And we need to create a high density, walkable, mixed-use downtown. Now, this is a very conservative community politically. Basically, if I hadn't put there's basically a highway intersection underneath this label, which is basically the city would just extend roads, zone land, and expensive high-end shopping centers and subdivisions would follow. But those days are over, because like any other place in America, this high-end single-family suburb now needs to appeal to a much wider spectrum of people of many different ages and lifestyles. And one thing that is certain is that relatively few of them want to go out and live in a subdivision. It was very interesting. We did a market study for Dublin. Dublin's housing market had been 90 to 95% single family for decades, and today it is 1/3 multifamily, think loft, and the other 2/3 is single family, but the trend is trending away from single family. I put this in here just because the Columbus Dispatch was so surprised at the new zoning that Dublin created that they ran an article about it, but it's to create environments like this and like this. Well, how did Dublin do this? They basically gained control of 1,000 acres of land, because similar to what the city was doing in East Franklinton, once they controlled the land, they could control its future. They could increase density to the point where they could create a walkable environment. That would then attract housing. It was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in this case, Dublin also did something that I think communities really need to do. They did a really good, it's just market studies, fiscal study that said if they invested $100 million, what would the return to the city be going forward? Because in an era where people and dollars and jobs want to move into cities, you can create a great deal of value when you aggressively move to reshape an area and basically control its future. From a different perspective, this can be the undoing of places too. We did a downtown master plan for Asheville, North Carolina. Do any of you know Asheville? Okay, Asheville is the embodiment of cool, and it is gentrifying rapidly. These condominiums before the recession cost $800 a square foot. That and these folks had nothing to do with each other, but they are why people came to spend $800 a square foot. So basically, the plan we did said, all right, Asheville is gentrifying very rapidly. It is the home to a really nervous, wonderful community of artists and craftsmen and musicians and makers and all kinds of really cool people who all seem to be about 15 years old, but really really vibrant. It has an amazing. There is one franchise business in downtown Asheville. It's a mushroom pizza. I didn't even know that was, or magic mushroom, something mushroom, not magic mushroom, mellow mushroom. I didn't even know it was a franchise because it was literally there was a golden goose and they didn't want to kill it in the crassest sense, but it was really important to maintain in place the people who had made this magic, who had made this wonderful place. Otherwise, what was the point? And so this was a plan that was all about allowing more of this development and putting it in the right place and making sure that as public benefits, it did some pretty amazing things. It subsidized retail space so that cool new startups could continue to start up. It paid for deeply subsidized, deep subsidy housing for artists. It built work sell spaces. It basically did the things that we could figure out that would keep this community in place as it continued to transition. So far it's been successful, and one of the most important things is there's a great downtown organization that keeps figuring out what else those dollars should be spent on. We did some planning in Washington, D.C., looking at 37 miles of new streetcar. And one of Washington's concerns was who's going to pay for this. It was very, very hard to compete and get federal. They had really been amazed in an unhappy sense when they put in for planning dollars to the feds, and they didn't get the grant. Other people did, because they thought, my God, we're Washington, we know what we're doing. So they began to see the writing on the wall. So what they did was really integrate planning for transit development, where neighborhoods were transit dependent, where, for example, there was the possibility of real walkability, so transit could really bring streets to life. It was a really micro-level study that looked at, where would it make a real difference in how fast people could get to work, et cetera. Where could you attract knowledge industry jobs from the surrounding suburbs into D.C.? So with all this in place, they then developed a route and a strategy, and it turns out that the value they'll create will pay for 2/3 of the cost of building the subway. So with all this, I've been talking about lots of the wealth that is moving into cities and the great people who are bringing it and their energy and innovation, but there are a lot more of us. And how to make cities work for everybody, I think, is how I'm going to sort of finish the talk. And it starts with the fact that our society, around income and many other ways, is growing, as I think everyone here knows, more and more fragmented. That means that it is more and more important to create places that bring diverse people together. And they can't just be a nice lawn, because only 3 people may want to lie on it and read, but that isn't bringing people of different ages and incomes and races together. There have to be things that actively attract them. Well, I don't know if you all know Bill Gilchrist, who is your director of place-based planning. Well, when he goes to heaven, for many reasons, one of the more important ones will be the fact that when he was the planning director in Birmingham, Alabama, he spearheaded the creation of something called Railroad Park. And Railroad Park brings people together. I won a jury for the Urban Land Institute, and we gave this project an award because of the amazing ways it brings people together. And I don't know if you can see it, but I have never seen a photograph with somebody doing that and these 2 nice young ladies walking by talking about whatever they're talking about. A place that can do all that and then have these kids walking along a stream is really amazing. What's more important is they all come from very different parts of Birmingham, and they come to this amazing park that almost purposely is in the middle of sort of an older industrial area because it's claimed by nobody. But it is so actively programmed that it literally, neighborhoods come together and have potluck dinners. How they quite manage, I don't know, to sort of meet each other here. It's really wonderful and really important if you're Birmingham. So this was, again, the city initiated this. It brought the community and business leaders together, and the city made the case that the business community needed to come up with the dollars to pay for this, and they did, because they really understood the social benefit. Jumping back out to the suburbs, this is Sandy Springs, Georgia, which is the most politically conservative community I have ever worked in. And I have to say, when we were doing the master plan, somebody here accused us of being communists, so there are many conservative communities. But this is a city that privatized city government. They basically fired everybody and hired a large engineering contracting firm to come in and basically do virtually everything that needs to be done in the city. They wanted to create a sort of a town green. It's a city of, it's ninth wealthiest community in America. It's a city of it's a city of successful subdivisions, I'll put it that way. And that wasn't enough for people. And their kids said, I don't want to live in Sandy's, right? There's no place to go, that kind of thing. So the community came together and said, we need a town green. And we did a wonderful planning process and got people really engaged who had never imagined that they wanted something urban in their midst. But by the end of the study, they did. And they are building a town green, and they're building it once again. And there's a continued message here in a city with something like still 40 or 50,000 abandoned lots and vacated properties. The city, this very conservative city, decided to invest $70 million in buying land. To my utter consternation, they used eminent domain to actually buy a key piece of property. And they did all this because it was so important to create community, and because once they went out and bought all the land, and this is a common story, they could then control its future. They knew that this would be a wise investment because they could guide the development, and in fact, they have just issued an RFP for a master developer for 47 acres who's going to create a downtown to go around the green. There are other wonderful things happening that are really bringing people together, and they're basically, I sort of think it's sort of about deepening and broadening the appeal of urban districts, because basically there is no bar that we can ever set. The bar constantly rises. We want wonderful, new, and exciting ways to come together and experience community. So San Francisco has a great program where the city works with bar owners, restaurants, businesses to basically go out and occupy part of the street on a, I'm sure you all know the term tactical urbanism, but on a temporary basis. This thing gets taken down if it doesn't work anymore, to create public spaces. It's happening all over the city. It's just really wonderful. And basically any place that there's some pavement that isn't necessarily used much of the time, these things are springing up. Well, do many of you know about the Broadway Boulevard? It's not an experiment anymore. It's happening in New York. Basically, New York is recapturing much of Broadway as sort of an extraordinary urban linear park. It's basically places where people like this just go out and sit and hang out and make music, and at 2 a.m. they're making a lot of music, etc., for miles and miles. And I think some of... I promise I wouldn't talk too much directly about New Orleans, but imagine Canal Street if it were a place that was basically a festival, that was a seam between the financial district and the French Quarter. And then there are some just incredible public spaces. And I forgot the name of the gardens, which I was going to put in Singapore, which sort of demonstrate these light towers basically generate solar energy. They spray mists to cool people. There is basically a large conservatory that collects pieces of every bit of nature in Singapore, et cetera. But it's an extraordinary park that demonstrates if a city wants to have a main park, a city park, they can become things today that have been unimaginable for so much of our lives. And then I'm going to sort of finish placemaking with talking about the role of preservation. I'll talk about this quickly because you talk so much about it here. I think the past is what gives meaning. It is what brings authenticity to our increasingly rapidly changing urban environments. But there are real reasons to build anew in historic areas, or in and around historic buildings. This is some higher density housing in the South End in Boston, where I happen to live, 80 units to the acre. It was built because the South End was gentrifying and there was a real commitment to affordable housing, and that had to be new housing, and it was designed very much to sort of reinforce the historic character. The very tall building here, this is something that we also did the planning for, was the first pharmaceutical research center in New England. Now, that may sound sort of technical to you, but boy, was it important to Boston's economy to attract big pharma research. This is the Longwood Medical Area. Harvard Medical School is right here. They could only go one place. They need a lot of density. This historic college basically owned a piece of land, and that building has preserved the college, but it also has demonstrated the ability to change densities very rapidly in a way that I think respects rather than threatens an historic environment. This is a compromise. This is another building in Boston, Atlantic Wharf, where the developer wanted to tear down some wonderful historic buildings. Basically, this is a huge millions plus square foot facadectomy, where as you walk along the street, Russia Wharf is still there. There's an immense tower full of great jobs, etc. Many would have preferred that this didn't happen, but it happened in such a way that did create incredible value for Boston and preserve the buildings. From a different standpoint, we do a lot of planning for innovation districts. What used to be sort of biotech parks have basically moved fast and furiously. And this is Kendall Square in Boston, in Cambridge, which is the most successful innovation community in the U.S. today, or was a biotech district. It is more productive than any other. You can ask me how that's measured later. It has been a place with lots of new buildings like this and like that, and buildings like this that were waiting to be knocked down, and it was getting duller and duller and duller. And Google and Akamai and some of the leading biotech research firms began to say, how are we going to attract people to work here? You know, we can only be here if folks with brains and education and creativity want to work here. And so after about a year of planning, what's emerged is that the most important thing to be able to fill buildings like this and build more of them is basically to create this and to weave old and new, to create a place that has a sense of authenticity and realness that people want to come to. It has to be a place people want to be, or they'll go someplace else, and with them will go Boston's innovation industry. And this is a photo I just love, which is new looking at the old and gaining meaning, I think, a great deal of meaning from it. So now we come to the, we've all gotten wealthier. Some of us have gotten wealthier. We've invested in great places that bring all of us together and make diversity work in the midst of make community work in the midst of diversity. But we have a very big issue that I think all of you are aware of. Since 1979, and frankly, you can think a little bit about when Ronald Reagan was elected president. This country has basically shifted from a position in which, because unions were strong and because of the kind of industries we had, as we became more productive, incomes went up. Well, since 1979, that doesn't work anymore. Basically, economic growth does not lift anybody. It lifts about the top 25% of us. The rest of us aren't. I mean, we can basically, these are real dollars, but for 80% of the private sector, as their companies become more productive, it has very little impact on their incomes. So that means we can't look to our economy to basically rescue people out of poverty, and we're developing a really significant problem, which is generational poverty. Poverty did not used to be inherited in this country. It most definitely is now. So one of the things that is making this worth is something that I believe in deeply, which is smart growth. And smart growth was supposed to work like this. You created a lot of vibrancy, and that created a lot of quality, and the quality, you can't really read this, but attracted human capital, and that attracted investment, and things got better and better and better. Unfortunately, it's short-circuited, because as you created vibrancy, and that created quality of life, it didn't really go to creating human capital. It went right to attracting a lot of investment. These places that are really great, and you see it in some of the real estate changes in real estate values in New Orleans, think of all those people trying to move into cities, our inability to provide enough housing, and when the neighborhoods are really cool, the extraordinary pressure on housing values. And these are often neighborhoods where poor people live. So in 2012, for the first time I can't say it, certainly since World War II, there are more poor people living in suburbs than there are in cities. There are more poor people outside of cities than in cities. And if you look at these circles, this is the last census, last 10 years, or 2010. Any circle that big is 100%. That means the population of poor people doubled in those metro areas out in the suburbs. Now, New Orleans actually has been relatively stable. That could very likely change dramatically in the near future, but its stability is actually really important because there are lots of very significant reasons why it's not great to, I'm going to be really crass, export poor people to the suburbs, because some things happen. First of all, think about all this, the earlier data that said it's healthier to live in walkable urban neighborhoods. You spend much less of your disposable income. Poor folks can't afford to spend 25% of their disposable income on a car. So basically, a very large number of them don't have a car. That means when you send them out to the suburbs, they can't get to jobs, they can't get to health care, they can't get to child care. You basically have reinforced all of the conditions that have basically kept them in poverty. But there's also another loss that is really profound. And this has not happened in New Orleans to a large extent, partly because you have a culture of neighborhood that I've never seen anywhere else. When I first came to New Orleans for the conference on rebuilding, there were about 700 people in the room, and America Speaks, who was operating managing the technology, basically did a survey, and everybody said whether they were the first, second, third, fourth, fifth generation or longer of their family to live in the same neighborhood. And a large majority were the third, fourth, fifth, or later generation in their neighborhood. There is no other place like that. Poor people in New Orleans are actually more likely to be in the same neighborhood than particularly if they're black, than if they're white and more middle class. Well, what that means is, and I'm going to skip over this very quickly, there's a very strong indigenous culture to a lot of neighborhoods. This is particularly along, for instance, the Claiborne Corridor. So this mother is obviously passing on traditions that are hugely important. In the process, she's doing some kind of amazing things. These kids are becoming citizens of their neighborhood. They're becoming connected to a social world that basically includes their family. They're beginning to network within a community. These networks break down, particularly as they grow older, social isolation, and play the same role that a lot of other networks that are more business-oriented play for many of us, that are much less available to people in poverty. And probably most important, they provide safe havens. This is the social safety net for neighborhoods like Treme and many other poor neighborhoods. And this exists in other cities, not as strongly as it does in Philadelphia, as it does in New Orleans. Philadelphia is another case. When you uproot people and send them to different neighborhoods, this is lost. And the loss can really be profound for people who don't have other resources. So I'm going to give you, I think, one more example of how to make a difference. This is planning that we did, actually again in Columbus, Ohio, for Wineland Park, which had the single highest concentration of Section 8 housing units, and is coming back rapidly in wonderful ways. But what is particularly wonderful is because the Ohio State University said, we're right next door, and for reasons of enlightened self-interest, we need to care. We have, we teach humanity and social consciousness. We need to practice it. 2, students aren't going to show up if we live in a tough neighborhood. So they took responsibility, partnered with the city to bring this neighborhood back. And you'll notice a familiar theme. The first thing they did was go out and get control of much of the land so that they could control the future, shape the destiny. And they did something that was really pretty wonderful. They created three different mechanisms for providing housing. So, which don't all fit on the slide. So the university actually bought all the Section 8, they work with a partnership to buy all the Section 8 housing units and make sure that they stayed, and had now attached social services and training and things that I'll talk about in a minute. They helped two community development corporations start building workforce housing, sort of subsidized housing, but not deeply. And they found a high-risk tolerant developer who's building 600, right now, actually 800 market rate units. As a result, Wineland Park, nobody is being displaced from Wineland Park. It is literally emerging as a third poor, a third sort of moderate income, and a third market rate. And it's working because it would not have worked for most of my professional life, but the people who have real choice, those who live in the market rate units, like diversity. There are enough of them to make this work in a way that wasn't possible. And I think it's a wonderful lesson, particularly as we think about a lot of neighborhoods in New Orleans undergoing transition. But just helping people stay in the city, in their same neighborhood, clearly isn't the full task, because we have there was a fellow who was appointed the receiver, Harry Spence, the receiver of the first city to go into bankruptcy in Massachusetts, Chelsea, and he was appointed to be the receiver. And he stood up one day and said, I've come to a realization. The rest of America is saying to Chelsea that when 40% of you get up in the morning, we don't care what you do all day. We don't need you. We don't need to know you're there. We don't know what you're doing. You have nothing to do with our economy. You live in your own sort of world of generational poverty, and the rest of us actually can ignore that. There's a certain cost to this. People have begun to calculate what the cost is of ignoring people in poverty, and it works out to about, one estimate is about $500 billion, about $500 billion a year. That's about 4% of our GNP. And if you think of the impact on crime, on people out of the workforce, and a whole series of things, you can begin to see where it comes from. But basically, when we did some research for New Orleans, we discovered that if you have a high school education, you can compete for about a third of the good jobs. They're not a McDonald's job. But you're competing with a lot more people than there are jobs. If you can just increase that by 2 years of technical training or college, these folks can compete for 85% of the jobs in New Orleans. And, it may be expensive to educate folks for 2 more years, but it pales in comparison to the cost of taking care of them for the rest of their natural lives, because they are completely dependent on welfare. And this is a much better life for many reasons. Now, it's not that simple, because there are all kinds of other issues going on. There are mothers who have no help in taking care of their children, their children. There are people who are depressed. There are all kinds of issues, as we all know. Substance dependency going on in a lot of neighborhoods. All of these things need to be dealt with. The irony is that in most cities, like New Orleans, the programs are all there, and there may even be close to enough dollars, but they're not organized. There's no synergy. The kind of collaboration that could really help somebody with all the issues in their life to lift them out of poverty isn't happening. And that's kind of a tragedy, so that's something else you can all go out and advocate about. I'm going to finish on resilience. And resilience is a very different kind of issue, because we used to say, it's the East Coast. The East Coast is sinking, the West Coast is rising. And if you look at where, if the ice cap melts, the impact is going to be much more severe on those of us in this room, and when I go home in Boston too. But if you look across the country, the impacts of weather change are really severe everywhere, meaning go west, young person, is you might as well just stay where you are. Now, resilience to really protect cities just from sea level rise will probably cost more in real dollars than the entire cost of building the interstate highway system, which is sort of seen as the largest sort of national initiative, most expensive thing we've done as a country, sort of single initiative. Could easily cost 2, maybe even 3 times as much. that sounds sort of impossible, except if you look at the costs to all of us of the tragedy of New Orleans and of Sandy. 2,000 lives were lost. A lot of people became refugees. But basically, the cost for rebuilding for the two storms together is probably going to be north of $200 billion. But we also lost about $100 billion in GDP just from Sandy. No one bothered to measure that for Katrina because we weren't thinking in those terms. As storms become much more frequent, clearly the cost is going to be much greater. And about 25% of America's economy is in 7 cities that are very much at peril as a result of rising sea levels. So we're going to do something. We simply have to. This could or could not represent the largest single investment in city building we've ever made, because it'll be the largest sort of coordinated, mission-driven investment. If you think about what I was saying a few minutes ago about the fact that cities are competing with the aging for dollars, if we have to spend $1 trillion on resilience, and most of our federal budget is being used up for Medicare and Social Security, et cetera, it's going to be really hard to find any dollars left to do any of the things that are so important for everybody in this room and for our cities and for our economies. So we have to find ways actually to merge resilience, a resilience agenda and an urban agenda. The dollars we spend, and this is actually, the Dutch have been a great help to New Orleans. I think the Dutch dialogues were terrific. Well, it turns out they have lots of things to say in this topic, but there are basically 2 that are particularly important. One is no retreat. When we started the master plan, there were, right before we started the master plan, we started actually the work under the Unified New Orleans Project, a certain Speaker of the House, who I shouldn't name, said it would make more sense to relocate New Orleans than to rebuild. It would be more practical. And Newt Gingrich should be remembered for that. When we started working on the master plan, there was a sort of a move that said the East is too expensive. We can't maintain services, et cetera. We need to sort of pull people back and let that go back to nature. As part of the master plan process, we had to sort of figure out, well, is that doable? And quickly, it's not doable. America has no way of moving 50,000 people. Where would they go? All this kind of thing. But it turns out it would be so much more expensive to move all these folks than to protect them. And when you protect them, you protect their culture, their community, you protect what New Orleans has built there. There are many moral reasons, but there are also very practical reasons for saying we can't get out of the way. What that means is that we really have to figure out how do we merge our environmental, our resilience, and our urban agenda. One little problem is this country doesn't actually have an urban agenda. We have no sort of national program for cities. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some pretty obvious things, I hope I've been talking about them, that we should start with. And I'm going to then move to the second point that the Dutch have made really, that I think is really important, and a lesson we have not fully embraced yet. After World War II, they realized they didn't have enough money, this might sound familiar, to rebuild their cities and to protect their cities. So they basically said that any dollar spent in protecting the Netherlands had to be a dollar spent in quality of life, in rebuilding cities, in tangible things that improve the quality of people's lives and livability. So, looking forward, when Mayor Bloomberg prepared his rather hasty but nevertheless I think important Plan NYC following Sandy, one of the things that he talked about, which was very important, was that New York could not retreat. Sea level around New York, Manhattan's going to rise the same 3 or 4 feet that's going to rise around Boston. And storms are much more frequent. They had to protect themselves. But rather than build walls around lower Manhattan, the theory is we should build into this. We should build new high-density, incredibly valuable neighborhoods, New York neighborhoods that haven't existed, out over the water, and these will be our seawalls, so that every dollar we spend protecting Manhattan is a dollar spent making Manhattan more livable, more prosperous, and more successful as a city. This is Hafen City in Hamburg, which is just a beautiful and wonderful example of doing the same thing. Historic Hamburg sits, in back of these. There is a seawall that protects it. It's kind of a staid city. They began to worry about rising tides. Their port was outmoded, and they basically decided to do something very similar, which is build a whole new community to protect Hamburg. But then this gave them a chance to build all the modern buildings, the large floor plates, the really cool architecture that didn't belong in historic Hamburg, but were really an important part of the future of a 21st century city. This is some of the coolest housing is here. So once again, it was every dollar spent in protecting Hamburg is spent in making Hamburg a more livable, successful place. And then this, I think, is just one of the coolest places that I can't pronounce. Chang, I think. I've had people help me with that, in Seoul. They basically daylighted a creek. Now, this is a little bit more than daylighting a canal, but basically, rather than hide flood control, they decided that flood control, for the same reasons, it's very expensive. We have to use it in ways that make Seoul more successful, that make Seoul more attractive for investment, a more livable place. So they basically daylighted this. They took a freeway away that was built over it. It's an incredible place, and frankly, it's the heart of downtown now, and it's just a wonderful environment. So on this note, this is one of my favorite photographs in the world. I took it when I first came to New Orleans. I just love it, and to me, it's the spirit of this wonderful city. So thank you for your wonderful patience, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer.